people had no exposure to the union that was organizing. And this process also gave me the knowledge and furthered my education that delay in the union busting field is critical to the union buster. That when a union first comes on the scene, they have the momentum, they have the drive, they have the backing. And they want to see it over within a fixed period of time, ideally 30 to 60 days. My training, and thus my application of that training, was to use the law to pervert that process. And in the case of this campaign in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, I took what should have been concluded in a couple of months and dragged it out to beyond a year, thus breaking down the people's spirit, breaking down the people's momentum, and overwhelming them, saturating them with such misinformation, mixed with the humility that the owners and the family were putting on that was just totally false, that I was able to be successful in that initial campaign, and delay and the rest of these manipulations became part and parcel to the balance of my career.
It sounds like you were able to affect the outcome of that particular campaign with a tactic that I have heard of before that's referred to as dilution of the craft and class. Now, is that accurate?
In a sense. I mean, it's stacking the deck, but the labor law that I worked most under was the National Labor Relations Act. And when you define a bargaining unit under that act, what the board or the agency looks for to approve a bargaining unit is a community of interest. So to expand the unit, whether it was multiple stores or even if it would have been a self-contained manufacturing facility, a union usually petitions for and seeks people they know will support them. So where I didn't have multiple stores, such as I had in Upper Michigan, I would go for gray area employees. A union might petition for a pure production and maintenance unit, but I would go after lead people, I would go after technicians, I would go after borderline professionals. I would find a way to take a proposed unit of, say, 100 people and at least double it in size by demonstrating that there was this community of interest between the proposed bargaining unit and the bargaining unit that I believed to be appropriate. And obviously I would be stacking that unit with people whose tendencies would not be favorable to a union.
When was the first time that you worked under the Railway Labor Act?
First time I worked under the Railway Labor Act was in 1973 at a supplemental airline in Oakland, California, known as World Airways. That was my first introduction to the Railway Labor Act.
What was that campaign like?
That campaign was one of the most interesting and creative and difficult that I had ever been through, because the company was owned 80% by an individual who was a pure robber baron, who was an alcoholic, who was a tyrant, and who was so obsessed with control that no personnel decision anywhere in the company, and the company had several thousand employees, could be agreed to or would actually become a decision without his involvement. And the company already had a union in place with its mechanics and some of its crew people, and the company's position there was that any grievance filed would have to go all the way to arbitration. This particular employer spent endless dollars, a bottomless pit of dollars, to fight the union. He was so angry and upset that there was a union in place there. When I came in, it was a clerical force of approximately 500 that wanted to organize. And although they were clerical, they still fell under the Railway Labor Act. And the lesson I learned there, as far as the Railway Labor Act, that I never lost sight of, is the Railway Labor Act is a relic. It's an antique. It's a dinosaur. Older, in fact, than the National Labor Relations Act. And because it was established for the transportation industry, some of its peculiarities include no procedure for unfair labor practice. In fact, the concept of unfair labor practice does not exist. And what that means is a company is free to campaign to any degree, to do whatever might be unethical, immoral, intimidating, or destructive in the process without concern for recourse. The only legal action that can be taken after to an employer would have to be through the civil or criminal process. And the other flaw that concerned me under this Railway Labor Act is when I ran a National Labor Relations Act campaign that would lead to an election, the election was supervised by the federal government on site at the employer. The Railway Labor Act representation elections are mail ballots, and they work in a very peculiar way. The Federal Mediation Board in Washington, D.C. mails these ballots out to the eligible people, the proposed bargaining unit people, and the process works as follows. Those employees have 2 weeks in which to return their ballots to the National Mediation Board. The ballot, however, contains no place to mark no. The way a person votes against the union is by not returning their ballot to the Mediation Board. And further, if the Mediation Board receives back 50% of the ballots that were mailed out, and half of those have the mark for the union wins. Well, facing something like that with an employer, chairman of the board of a company who was as volatile and unpredictable as any person I had ever worked with in my career, was somewhat scary. But in that situation, because you have to do what you have to do when you're hired to bust a union, that's your focus. And a union buster is only as good as his last case. So just to further that experience and my first exposure to the Railway Labor Act, what I did in that situation is I had 500 people in this voting unit, the majority of which were female office clerical employees, and a volatile, unpredictable employer. So one day I was working with one of the management people, in fact, a director of maintenance, who was a lookalike to Tom Selleck. And we were kind of joking and yakking back and forth. And he said, you know, if the girls in my department, and he had maybe a dozen clerical employees, would bring their ballots into me, torn in half, and put them on my desk, he jokingly said that he would streak Oakland Airport. And streaking in the early 70s was quite a fashionable trend. I took him up on what he thought was something he said in jest and got him to agree that if a majority of the eligible voters brought their ballots into him torn in half, that he would streak Oakland Airport. And I guess his macho self-image and his ego, and also his awareness that if he didn't, his job might be in jeopardy, he agreed to this sideshow. And in fact, we got the word out through the grapevine that this event would take place. And within 48 hours of the employees receiving their ballots from Washington, 80% of those ladies brought their ballots to Tom Ripa's office, that was his name, torn in half, and he kept his word. The day after we knew we had won the election by receiving 80% of the ballots destroyed, we put him in the back of a limousine, drove him to the far end of a shut-down runway at the Oakland Airport, but that was visible to the hangar where most of these employees did their job. We brought him there in a fur coat only. He got out of the car. We took the fur coat, drove the car to the other end of the runway, and he proceeded to run with running shoes only from one end of the runway to the other. So a silly sideshow to protect a union bust was the mode there. So the Railway Labor Act was introduced to me in somewhat of a comedic way. But when you're hired to bust a union, you'll go to any length, and they're not all humorous.